Don't tell me that the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass. Hello and welcome to Shining Moon episode 32, Novella Writing. I'm your host, Deborah L. Davitt. With me today are Bendi Barrett, Laurence Raphael brothers, P.A. Cornell, and Premee Mohamed. Let's start with some introductions. Bendi Barrett is a queer Black creator of speculative fiction in both fiction and interactive game narratives. His debut novella, The Empire of the Feast, which we will be discussing today, was a 2023 Ignite Award finalist for Best Novella. His work has appeared in Baffling Mag, Pank Magazine, and several anthologies, including the BSFA awards long-listed Luminescent Machinations. He also writes erotic fiction and games under the pen name of Benji Bright. Nonetheless, his mother has implied she is very proud of him. Welcome to the podcast, Benji. You are so brave to let your mom read some of that stuff, because I do not let my mom read the spicy stuff at all.
Yeah, she's trucking along despite some mild head shaking. So, we take what we can get.
Yeah, exactly. Laurence Raphael Brothers is a writer and technologist with 5 patents and a background in AI and internet R&D. He has published over 50 short stories in such magazines as Nature, Podcastle, and Galaxy's Edge. His noir urban fantasy novella series, consisting of The Demons of Wall Street, The Demons of the Square Mile, and The Demons of Chiyoda, has just added a new volume, The Demons of Montmartre. While his standalone novel, The World's Shattered Shell, has also recently been published. We will be talking about yet another novella today because he is a master of the form. Laurence, welcome to the podcast.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I think it might be a bit of an exaggeration as I've mastered the form, as you might be able to tell. But I'm very happy to be able to talk about it, however.
All right. Thank you so much for being here. P.A. Cornell is a Chilean-Canadian graduate of the Odyssey Workshop who has published over 30 original pieces of short fiction in respected genre magazines, including Lightspeed, Apex, and Fantasy. Her work has also appeared in over 20 anthologies, including the Year's Best Canadian Fantasy and Science Fiction Volume 1, which also listed her debut science fiction novella Lost Cargo as one of the best of 2023. We're going to be discussing it today. It's really good. Her story Splits went on to win Canada's 2022 Short Works Prize, and most recently she was long-listed for the BSFA Awards for her story Things Most Meaningful. When not writing, Cornell can be found assembling intricate Lego builds or drinking ridiculous quantities of tea. Sometimes both. For more on the author and her work, visit her website, pacornell.com. Hi, Patty. Welcome back to the podcast. I get to talk with you 2 weeks in a row.
Yeah,
I get to talk with you this week and next week about food and food ways. So this is going to be awesome.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the food one too. They're both going to be great episodes.
Yeah, I think so. Premee Mohamed is a Nebula, world fantasy, and Aurora-winning Indo-Caribbean scientist and speculative fiction author based in Edmonton, Alberta. She has also been a finalist for the Hugo, Ignite, Locust, British Fantasy, and Crawford Awards. She is the author of the Beneath the Rising series of novels, as well as several novellas. Her short fiction has appeared in many venues, and she can be found on her website, www.premeemohamed.com. Welcome to the podcast, Premee. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be here, especially as someone who has 4 novellas out this year. How is that even possible?
I don't know. You are amazing.
Very, very tired.
I bet. We had one lady on for the horror episode who was going to have something like 10 different novels or things she had edited out in the same calendar year. Everybody asked her, how do you manage to do this? And she says, well, working on my PhD is actually the most relaxing part of my day. And we all just went, we're not worthy. Again, you are amazing to be having 4 of them coming out in a single year.
Yeah, I didn't schedule that, but we can certainly talk about publishing schedules later in the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to. My own novella is scheduled to come out in 2025, so I'm very early in the cycle. So I haven't seen edits, I haven't seen anything. I just know that my cover is going to be green. It's great. All right, let's dive into our initial questions. We're going to start with, how does writing a novella differ for you from writing short fiction? How does your process differ writing at length than with writing, say, flash fiction? And I'm going to bop to the bottom of my list. I'm going to pick on Premee a little bit because you wrote a wonderful, wonderful flash fiction that we talked about in a couple of episodes ago. And I wanted to kind of pick your brain because you can obviously write at the very, very short micro level, and you can also write at this macro level. How does your writing process differ? And when you're writing short versus long?
Yeah, I think since I taught myself to outline, that's kind of where the biggest difference is. So when I'm outlining a novella, I'm actually outlining it more the way I do a short story than I do a novel. So for a novel, I'm looking to make absolutely sure that there are no sort of editor-sized plot holes or anything like that, and make sure that all the world building is really substantial and in place and is kind of like really well-built pillars holding up the roof of the premise. Whereas for a novella, I think because of the length, readers are more willing and able actually to do more of the world building with you, to kind of participate. And it's like when I read the Murderbot novellas, for instance, which I love, I wish they would just leave it alone to watch its shows, but like a lot of the description is just very sort of sketched out. Like I saw a space station and it was triangular and smaller than the last one. And the reader kind of brings like a backpack full of preconceptions and visuals and knowledge and ideas. So the reader is very much, I think, more engaged with a short story or a novella. So when I write to the novella length, I say, okay, the reader gets to hold up more of that weight, and I can focus on the character development and what people are feeling and doing and why their motivations are moving the plot forward. So for short stories, it's kind of like all vibes. And then for novellas, it's like vibes and plot. And then for novels, it's plot. So for me, it kind of runs on a spectrum.
All right, I'm going to bop over to Bendi, and I'm going to ask you the same question. How does your process differ depending on the length of the project that you're looking at?
Yeah, I think I've come to love structure, and to kind of like to continue that thread of like what it takes to create a novella. It's like one of the things that I absolutely love about the novella form is how you kind of have to trust your reader, right? Like you have to trust that they're not going to, whereas in a novel, something might come across as like a plot hole or something neglected. There's a certain kind of inference and sort of a lack of direct hand holding that you participate in with your audience. And so, but still I found like for writing flash fiction, I love it. I love writing flash fiction. I love just kind of like creating things off the top of my head that like, I actually think like the way that I came into writing was I had a writing mentor who made me do kind of like almost like story sprints. You're just like, give me an idea and then give me 20 minutes and like, that's it, right? Like whatever you wrote is what you wrote. And I feel like that's a callback to that. And like having that as my background, it speaks to me to be able to write something that just comes off the top of my head. And then I just kind of leave it alone as much as possible, clean it up, but just kind of like leave it sort of as close to the original form as possible. So all that to say is I had to kind of eventually come around to structure and plotting and actually spending time making guardrails for myself. Yeah, like I kind of think about the novella as sort of like a short-term puzzle, instead of a novel, which is this beast of moving things, or in my case, I've written several kind of like novel length interactive fiction projects, which it's like a it's like the moving things now all are darting away from you and trying very, very hard to break your programming. So the novella for me is almost like a relaxing break where I can just like put something into an outline, and we'll talk, I'm sure I'll talk about a little bit more about that, like in the specific structure of Empire of the Feast and how that came about. But like, I do love the guardrails and being able to plot things, and it feels kind of clean and elegant at the end. And what's not clean and elegant, you're just like, yeah, the reader's going to just fill it in. They're going to fill it in.
You can trust the reader in this case. Whereas in a novel, I've written several novels, and I also wrote a very long form fan fiction of 1 million words. Don't shoot me. And my readers
only
kept
shooting
writing.
You with praise, because that's a lot of words.
Thank you. It's a lot of words. And my readers kept writing in questions, and I kept having to basically repeat and revise and extend and explain. So there was a lot of hand-holding, even though they all knew the universe. I was working in somebody else's IP. And so there was a lot more hand-holding in that long form. So I will agree with that. Laurence, how about you? How does writing a novella differ for you from writing short fiction or from writing a novel?
Well, for me, a novella is closer to a novel than it is to a short story. I feel like it's a constrained novel. That's not to say it's that way for everyone, just for me. So when I purely pants short stories, if I make notes, it's rare, before actually starting to draft a short story. But I plan a novella. I don't necessarily plan it entirely, because I have this way of writing outlines even for novels and then deviating from them in chapter 3. So
yes,
but it's reassuring.
I do the same.
It's reassuring to have the framework and structure planned out, even if you do wander off. But for me, the distinctive quality of a novella is constraint leading to sort of paradoxical freedom. So. Whereas a novella can span all kinds of, a novel can span time, space, characters, scenes very freely, or it can constrain itself if it wants. A novella necessarily has to constrain something of time or space or scenes or characters or something like that.
Yeah.
So you often see novellas that only take place over the course of 1 or 2 days or even less time, whereas a novel might go on for years, with episodes and so on. But somehow, despite the planning that I put into a novella, and despite these constraints on the number of words and the shape and other qualities, I feel like I'm allowed to luxuriate in a novel in a way that I'm not able to do in a short story. And moreover, I can't explain it, but it feels freer in many ways than a novel, which is theoretically should be just like the ultimate freedom, because there isn't any cap on the words or anything like that, but no hard cap anyway. But it just feels.
I would compare it overtly to writing form poetry, because when you're writing form poetry, you have the form as a guide, and it helps inform and shape and influence what you actually wind up putting on the page. So those constraints are basically a co-writer for you. And when I'm writing form poetry, I very rarely have an idea of what's going to come out, but it winds up being beautiful anyways, because the form has been my co-pilot. And I am personally sort of a mix of plotter and pantser. I write to signpost scenes. I know where I want to get to, but sometimes the characters disagree with me along the way, and I have learned to listen to them because they are smarter than I am, almost invariably. And so, it is an interesting journey to write a novel or a novella. Patty, how about you? When you're writing short fiction, how does your process differ than when you're writing a novella?
Well, like Laurence said, I tend to be a pantser when it comes to short fiction, so I very rarely will write like even just a note or two. Most of it just seems to be discovery writing for the most part. I'll do a little of that for longer fiction, but it's then I will kind of set some sort of at least a loose outline for myself. And I feel like the more intricate the story, the more characters, the more notes I have. Because I have to make sure it all kind of interweaves, that it's all, not just fun for me, but like actually has some, influence on what the story's about in some way. So that's probably the main difference. I'd say like it's been said, the novella form gives you a bit of freedom that you don't get with short fiction, in the sense that you can get a little bit more complex. You can delve more into your characters, into the background and that sort of thing, without necessarily doing as much as you do in a novel, as you guys put it, hand-holding. It's, a novella kind of forces you to have a little bit more of a faster pace. So you kind of have to, skip over some of those things and trust your reader, as Bendi was saying, to just keep up with you. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and move back to another question, which is, structurally, when writing a novella, are you able to use some of the same techniques as you do in Flash? Because Flash is almost always about structure, about trying to convey in a very short amount of space, in a very finite amount of time, a concept or a vibe that you want to get across, whether you're doing it in a listicle format, or you're doing it in a circular format, or you're doing it in media res format or something like that. You're doing it in some sort of structure to, at least to when you most of the most effective Flash fiction that I've read, I should say, has been like that. In a novella, when you're trying to come full circle, it's your distance around the circumference is so much longer. Are you able to come full circle, or do you find yourself writing in a straight line? Do you find yourself doing interweaving techniques more often? Yeah. And I wanted to call out Bendi in particular, because you used a poetical device in the Empire of the Feast, where you were using repetition as a structural element in one of the minor characters' dialogue, and it just kept coming back. It was almost a call and response, and I was just like, I'm there for this. So let's start with you. When you're writing a novella, what are some of the structural techniques that you use to create a skeleton and move the reader along through it?
I really love that question, because it's sort of like, I think when you've been a sort of professional writer for a certain amount of time, so much of the tricks that you're using to endear yourself desperately to the reader are sort of like become a background hum, if that makes any sense. And
it does.
That sort of calling out of the repetition as technique sort of made me reflectively look back to the book to see what kinds of techniques I sort of employed. And because of the nature of the book and how it came along, I sort of knew what I was writing up front, and I knew I wanted it to be this big, grand political thing. But with such like a truncated runtime, right? Like you don't really have the word count to flesh out this entire reality. And so I think the technique sort of everybody's going to come at it a little bit different, but like I sort of like was I was like, I want to yoke the main character sort of not knowing what the hell is going on with the reader not knowing what the hell is going on, and sort of acclimate them simultaneously to this world. And
that was very effective, by the way, because I walked in and I started going, am I in the grim, dark future of 40K? No, I'm not. No, I'm not. I am very much not. The orgy scene? was not expecting. Neither was the was the narrator, so we were in tune there.
Yeah. It is. Yeah. So there I think there are a couple things in play, and I think you do sort of have to, as you say, like you kind of have to figure out like a way to rapidly account for the revolution that you're going to have from kind of like the starting point to, you know, the ending. If you do kind of want it to, if you want to kind of rely on like these kind of like touchstones and kind of like this emotionally complete journey for whoever your characters are. And I think there are a number of ways that I sort of buried those techniques in the story, the repetition being one, the amnesiac narrator being another.
Yeah, thank you very much. We'll move over to Laurence now. When you're writing a novella, do you find yourself using some of the same techniques as Flash? Do you do any full circle? How do you wind up structuring things? I noticed that your primary use of of structural repetition was just the lighthearted humor in your novella. For what we're going to be reading today is the light badinage. And that carries the reader through on just this lovely, lighthearted cloud, and as you're moving rapidly through all these action scenes, so it worked really well.
Well, thanks, but I'm not sure I would really characterize it as structure so much as tone.
Okay.
And also for me, my Flash, you know, I love Flash as a form, but my Flash is rarely structurally interesting. It's more, I write more of an atomic vignette more than anything else, rather than you know, listicles or complicated you know, rondos or anything like that. But one thing I would say about Flash, which by the way I recommend to any writer who doesn't actually write it yet, is that the spareness and focus on the word level, which I'm sure this is true of poetry too, really informs writing at every length.
Yes, it does.
So if you have to fit a story, and it could just be a vignette, but it could be a beginning, middle, and end thing, into 750 words, you know, and do it without it seeming like it's a synopsis or really some kind of truncated piece of junk. To achieve that at all, it's really challenging. But the techniques at the low level, at the very low sentence and putting sentences together level, can be very useful for longer forms.
Oh, very much so.
So that's what I'll say about Flash to novella or novel. This particular novella was not structurally interesting, I would say. You know, the vibe and tone and hijinks along the way happened to work out in a sort of Aristotelian narrative consistent way. You know, so as and I was happy that they did, because otherwise I would have been sort of stuck. But there wasn't an attempt to do anything very complex with mirroring or internal reflections on things. One thing I will say is that for every form whatsoever, a simple technique that works really well is to have bits of the beginning mirror the ending. And this works just as well for the opening and closing lines of Flash and the opening and closing chapters of a novel. And it doesn't have to be bald or obvious, but that feeling of closing the circle can be very helpful. And much as I believe this generally, I didn't put any thought into that for this novella.
Fair enough. Patty, how about you? Structurally, how do you wind up working on your novellas? Do you use any of the same techniques as Flash, or do you find that you are using completely different structural elements?
It's tough to say, because I feel like with a novella, you can almost do anything. Like, it gives you so much freedom to just, you could make it like one long poem, or, you know, or whatever, make it like a short novel. anything you want to do, it can give you the freedom to experiment, I guess is what I'm saying. So I don't know that I consciously, sat down to write Lost Cargo and said, I'm going to use some of these techniques I learned from Flash, but I'm sure, some of that goes in there, especially when you're editing and you need to trim things down or whatever. You need to, as Laurence was saying, you have to focus more on the words, like how can I say this or convey this with fewer words that are maybe more effective words. So that, and then I also feel like when you do use any of these techniques, it's much more subtle in longer form than it would be in Flash, because in Flash you can kind of see it, especially if it's an obvious structure like a listicle or something. You can just take one look at it and see the whole thing, go, okay, this is a listicle. But like if you're using some of those techniques in longer form, it's kind of woven in there, almost invisibly. So I think it can be at least tougher to point to that and say, like, yes, this is this technique here, but the effect is just as powerful if done right.
I would agree with that. It is like I said, if you're coming full circle around the circumference of a novella that is vastly larger, it's very hard to see that full circle structure unless you do land on the same words as in the very beginning, that sort of thing. But if you're doing that mirroring technique like Laurence mentioned, and you have at least some similarities, it's subtle, but it's there, and it creates that same sensation of fullness and of recognition in the reader that it does in Flash. So, Premee, how about you? What are some structural elements that you like to use in novellas that may or may not come out of Flash?
Okay, so I'm glad I went last because I've been thinking about this and now I can crib off everybody else. Thank you. It's a tough question because I actually don't write a lot of Flash. I find Flash very intimidating. When I look at my published stories, there's probably like a handful, maybe 3 to 5, that would be at the Flash length. And I think almost all of those were solicited. Like somebody said, can you write me something that's X many words? And my first instinct is like, no, I can't. What a horrifying idea. But the more I think about it, the more I kind of think about it as art, right? So like Flash is like a cool snapshot or an interesting Polaroid. What makes it interesting is partly the form and partly that we are describing something so circumscribed. And when I look at my work, I again find that. So the novella maybe isn't like the full wall covering canvas of a novel. It's a smaller piece. But if you want, you can compose it out of like 10 Polaroids in 2 stacks of 5 or something like that.
Absolutely.
And where I see that is where the story calls for it. So one of my novellas, And What Can We Offer You Tonight, which was published by Neon Hemlock, the joke was that it was all vibes, no plot. But what I see in that is a lot of Flash sort of in the scenes and not so much in the structure, because Flash doesn't have to have beginning, middle, end, like Laurence was saying, that Aristotelian structure. It's more like I built a very, very unshelved bookcase. So it's just a rectangle that's blank. And now I can put books on it willy-nilly, basically. So, some of the scenes themselves look like Flash. They can be pulled out of isolation. And even if you don't know the characters, you can kind of see this small snapshot of their lives and their personalities and their motivations and their goals. And then I look at another one of my stories, These Lifeless Things, which was also at the novella length. And I think I did it again. That's Flash again, pretty much, because it's told with actually kind of a complicated structure. One narrator is writing in journal entries, another is writing with a first-person narrative, and one's in the past, one's in the future, and the novella details kind of where they touch. But each of those journal entries, again, you could pull that out. It doesn't have a beginning, middle, end necessarily. It's a Flash story. It's the description of a Polaroid of this woman's life after the end of the world. And then what we have with the other narrator is somebody coming along and discovering these small, vivid pieces of life that are still sort of full color, that still have the image in them. And so that was actually very difficult to outline. Because again, when you're keeping 2 timelines straight, but you want them to touch at specific points, I can't pants that. My editor would have killed me. But But I like the idea that you see the flash structures when you look at the piece as a whole afterwards. Not so much that I'm using them to construct it, but that afterwards I can go to the shelf. So for these lifeless things, that was a very, that was an IKEA shelf. It had 8 shelves on it or something, and I get to choose the books that go on each shelf and what order they go in and which books they are. But it's, you can only pull the book off afterwards and see, oh, that was a flash.
Nice. I'm going to take a moment to shamelessly plug something that I wrote last year, actually a couple of years ago, and it came out last year, which is Bounded by Eternity, which is my novella in verse form. And that was 100% pantsed because I was using the form of the poems to help me write and create each individual poem. And then each individual poem was a section of the story. And then I had to go back and, okay, now that I know where I'm going, I backfilled some other stuff for the introduction. And I went forward and I did some more stuff over here to fill in some of the other characters that had come into the narrative. And then it becomes a cohesive whole that tells the story of a woman who has willingly given up a lot of her memories to the Fae King because they were just such horrible memories of lost love and of lost relationships and things like that. But she's given up so much of herself that she doesn't know who she is anymore. And then when he discovers that his lover is pregnant and she's given up all of herself to him, he gives her herself back, and she has to deal with all the memories coming back into her and becoming herself once more. And it's an interesting ride. It was very interesting to create, but again, it's that Polaroid technique that you were talking about, because each poem has to be able to hang by itself. Otherwise, it's not a poem. And so, but they have to also come together as a cohesive whole. Otherwise, it's not a novella. So, yeah. Anyways, that's in its second year of Elgin eligibility. So anybody who's interested should totally read it. I will be happy to provide you with a copy. All right, let's go into each person's individual works.
Sorry, I just really wanted to touch on something that Laurence had said about kind of like writing in like flash fiction sort of, and also as you're kind of pointing to, Deborah, like the ways that like verse and flash fiction should inform writing. I think it's such an incredible gift to give yourself as there's a million ways to get to being a good writer, right? But like I came from a poetic background, and I think like the jump to fiction was so jarring to me because I found that a lot of people that I was learning from, they didn't necessarily care too much about the kind of like the craft on the sentence level. And I was getting too hung up on the craft on the sentence level and ignoring that there are other big things that you need to pay attention to. But I think like if you have only ever written long form fiction, do yourself a huge favor and write short. And like focus on concision for a time, because it really blooms your work in a way that like you can't really appreciate until you've like spent time working on the micro level.
I will 100% agree with that, because I came to writing initially through long form. I mentioned that 1,000,000-word fanfic. Then I wrote 3 novels that were about 600 pages each, and I self-published those. Then I got involved with Codex and Codex contests, and the contests were all in the microfiction range, and that has changed and shaped my writing in an amazing way. Now when I'm writing things, I'm like, I can actually hit that 120,000 word mark and not feel like I have so much more to say that can be reserved for another book. You can do it, Deborah. You can be concise. You really can. So it is a gift to be able to write at any length and to be able to hit the target with precision. There's accuracy, there's precision, and those are 2 different things, and they matter in writing. So yeah, I 100% agree. We're going to talk about your individual works now. I'm going to start in alphabetical order. So we're going to be starting with Bendi. Empire of the Feast came out from Neon Hemlock Press in 2023. This novella opens with an impressive bang, a consciousness extinguished into death. Again. And when that consciousness awakens, it is no longer the 31st Empress of the Feast, but the 32nd Emperor, who calls himself Riversun, magically reincarnated by the power of the Rapacious, a hungry, seemingly eldritch entity locked within the heart of a nearby star. Riverson has to ascertain who killed his predecessor, who the rebels against his rule are, and why. All of this, while perhaps reshaping the whole of a galaxy that has been conditioned into unthinking obedience to the undying Empress, all while trying to regain memories seemingly lost in the reincarnation process. I was particularly impressed, as I mentioned before, by your use of repetition. Leads the Emperor's major domo repeatedly states that certain things are aspirational, and it changes each time from this almost lighthearted thing to increasingly dark and sinister as he repeats it. And so each time it is a different inflection, a different intonation, and it becomes something just very, very dark and cold. So I was really impressed by that. What other techniques did you use to unify this sprawling story of a distant and, dare I say, grimdark future? Where did you draw inspiration from in writing this novella? And I'll have more questions as we go along, but go for it. Talk to me about this. This is wonderful.
Yeah. So as we covered a little bit, I think the repetition is sort of
that's clearly out of your poetic roots. When you said that you came out of this at the crafting things at the sentence level, I'm like, I can see this.
I think, well, first of all, thank you. And I think that like the repetition sort of, I think, creates the character of leads because they are meant to sort of be the authority and kind of pour information into the reader and also the main character's perspective to kind of inform them of everything that's happened while they've been dead or before they were dead, and which creates kind of an interesting way to talk about this. But it also speaks to Leeds' character as a sort of designer of this dystopian empire. As one of the kind of like the main hands, they are willing to destroy a planet on a whim just to send a message that like the empire is displeased. Let's blow up a planet. And Riverson is like, ooh, I don't know. And so when this person who sort of seems like a vacuum of empathy says something is aspirational, what does that mean? What does that mean to the character? What should it mean to the reader? Should you ever be aligned with what Leeds thinks is aspirational? And I think that's a sort of a question that the main character has to ask himself at the end of the story.
What I also found was fascinating is that, as you say, he is exposition person, shall we say. And by making them a character that is amoral and it calls into question everything that is in the exposition. It makes everything that you think you're relying on suspect. And it's a very interesting technique to make everything feel so uncertain for the reader, because just as you think that you feel like you can put your foot on something solid, it moves. But you still trust the author you create such credibility with Riverson that the reader feels comfortable going with you on this journey. So again, well done.
Yeah, I think that the thing about, thank you, and also the thing about the sort of credibility was huge in writing the story. It is, I guess it's a bit of a spoiler, but if you don't want to be spoiled, you can just come back to this, I guess. I think, I think this is more of a theme, but it sort of became a technique as I was writing the book or outlining it. There's sort of like, I was writing about empire and the people who run it. And I think like it became very clear to me that in the story I was telling, there were to be no like good guys. There's no purity when you're sort of engaged in the work of empire. And so I think every win is extracted from compromise. There are no clear solutions. And that's sort of like the raison d'etre of the story, right? Like I think the Staghead Empire, where this takes place, is sort of like the natural conclusion I think you come to if you take kind of like politicking and just like stretch it out to like the universal level. And so I tried to shape like the villain of this story as like not being any one character because there's so much backstabbing and there's so many reversals that like the sort of the ultimate villain was sort of like the voraciousness of empire itself and the kind of the vacuousness of morality.
Okay.
And so I think every part of the story sort of contributed to that feeling of like you said, sort of shifting sand underneath your feet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Why write it as a novella instead of a novel? Because you obviously could have easily made this into a novel. Why choose the constraints of a novella?
So this novella came about because I spoke to Dave Ring, the editor, and CEO and Galaxy Brain of Neon Hemlock, and he asked me to be a part of that story cycle, the novella cycle, and I asked him in return, like what are you missing? Like, what in your ideal world, like what kind of book would you put in this slot where I am? And I think he's just said like, oh, like a space opera would be dope. And I was like, perfect. I'm going to write something completely inadvisable, something sort of absurd in tone, and something entirely too horny. And then you will have to market it. And it sort of became like a set of it's almost like more of a set of dares than a book necessarily. But at sort of at every point.
Sorry.
No, I mean, I know how ridiculous it is. I wrote it for sure. But like, it was always a novella. There was never a sort of a moment where it wasn't that. And so I think it is sort of a great compliment when I talk to people and they're like, there's a novel in here. And I'm kind of like, I've tricked you. Because you sort of like all of and this is again to go back to the idea of like trusting your reader and kind of like not necessarily holding their hands in the novella length. They sort of build the world that you sort of gesture to, and it is a phenomenal gift to a writer to create something that makes the reader think there's so much more here that I can almost grasp, when it's just the kind of the magic of smoke and mirrors.
Interesting. Well, since this was obviously a requested novella, was there much of a revise and resubmit process, or was it just sort of accepted as soon as you handed it to him and said, here you go, you dared me, here it is. Now it's all yours to deal with.
So before I wrote one word of the book, I wrote a sort of a detailed outline. So sort of everything was outlined, every beat, every plot point, every major revelation and twist and turn. So yeah, a little bit. It was like I just kind of like just wrapped everything up in a bow, handed it to Dave, and was like, yeah, exactly. Like, now it's your problem. Like, I accepted the dare. I spent 2.5 months like seeing no one so that I could make this thing for you. Here it is. Sorry. And you're welcome.
Oh my God. All right. We're going to move to Laurence now and you're going to have to say the name of the novella, because my languages were Russian and German and Anglo-Saxon, not French. So is it Pâtissier et Étranger?
Pâtissier étranger, but you'll have to forgive my French pronunciation because it's terrible as well.
This came out from Brigid's Gate Press in 2024. So
actually, it has not come out yet. It has not yet. It's a contract signed novella, but it hasn't even been edited yet.
Okay. So it's on the docket, but not quite there yet.
Yes.
All right. So I can't link to this in the show comments, but keep your eyes out for it because it is delightful. The year is 1967. The place is Paris, the Cordon Blanc Institute. And George Drake wants nothing so much as to graduate from this prestigious pastry school alongside his friends, including Brigid, with whom he thinks of with both love and friendship. Except as he's thrust into a swirling frenzy of spies from multiple different countries, all vying for the power of aliens. Aliens who need sugar to be transported back to their world to help their people regenerate more quickly. And Brigid is one of those aliens. I was delighted by this novella's wit and charm and the smoothness with which the spy hijinks melded with the high cuisine. So much so that I really wish that we could feature this next week on Food and Foodways. I will probably be referring back to it because all the turns of the pastry, all the descriptions of the food, it's going to be mentioned again. What gave you the inspiration for this novella, Laurence?
Well, I'm not 100% sure of all the things that motivated this weird mashup of different elements. I had been reading a lot of French genre literature in translation over the last few years, including the Lupin stories from the turn of the century and the Maigret stories, detective police procedurals. That is, in fact, Chief Inspector Maigret at the end of the novella, although he is not named. Because his career was just coming to an end in 1967. But one thing that motivated me was, for whatever reason, the old French film Le Grand Blanc avec une chaussure noire, the tall blonde man with one black shoe, came to mind. And this is a spy thriller about, well, a sort of ludicrous, humorous noir story about this hapless musician who gets caught up in police intrigue and rivalry amongst people in the sûreté around this time. And thinking about that period, I was thinking about alien visitation science fiction. The Man Who Fell to Earth is not a direct influence because the characters and style and tone is so different. And this is a cozy,
Yeah, it is.
A cozy spy thriller. But / baking drama / alien visitation story. But some of the feeling that writers and filmmakers seem to have during this sort of 60s and 70s came to mind for this story. Mm-hmm. So, I really don't know why I wrote it exactly, but I knew that I wasn't going to submit it to my publisher for my noir series because that publisher doesn't like romance. And they're otherwise great. Mirror World is great. But so I just happened to see that some random tweet from Brigid's Gate saying, "Hey, does anyone have a cozy novella?" Oh, well, okay, sure. So I submitted it. There was no R&R. I doubt there will be severe edits, but I haven't actually received them yet. So we shall see about that.
Publishing and its timelines are fascinating and mysterious, and I'm getting a lot of hand waves from across the.
So I don't even know if it's actually coming out in 2024 or if it will be scheduled for 25 yet. But we shall see. Another clear motivation for this story was the growing popularity of baking and cooking shows, as well as the fact that here on Codex we have the great Beth Cato, who is an excellent baker and has her own baking blog, and I have been messing around with some things, and for whatever reason, all these elements came together. Anyway,
awesome. All right, we're going to move. Since you answered all of my questions before I could ask them, we're going to move to Patty now. PA Cornell, Lost Cargo, Mocha Memoirs Press 2022. Parker, who lost a child in infancy, has turned to a cold sleep voyage to the stars and a colonial birth in the hopes of making something new of her life. But the pod she was in has malfunctioned, and has landed on a dangerous moon used by terraformers for the sport hunting of manufactured monsters. And the ship that carried the pod has already moved on its journey. The only hope the survivors have of rescue is a dangerous trek to the remains of the terraforming camp in the hopes of sending a signal to Earth before the satellite that might relay the message decays in its orbit and crashes through the atmosphere, burning up. Everything becomes a battle for survival as the hostile landscape takes its toll on the survivors and they bicker over the best way to save their lives while retaining their humanity. The opening of this is a tour de force as the survivors awake from cold sleep and into the cold reality of bitterly damaged comrades, of children who are now lost to them, of family and relationships that have been torn apart because they are separated from the rest of the colonialists that were being sent off. Again, what gave you the inspiration for this novella, and why write it as a novella rather than as a novel or a short story?
Okay, the inspiration's rather, it's almost silly. I was talking to a friend who had just come back from a trip somewhere, and she was telling me how they lost their luggage. And she's telling me all like how this basically, upended their whole like vacation plan because they didn't have clothes, they had to get clothes, this whole thing. And I was thinking like, what an incredible inconvenience this is. But what if it was something on a bigger scale? Like, what if it was like a trip on an interstellar level and they lost passengers? And, then you're a bit more than just inconvenienced. So that's kind of the little nugget where that started. And then I interwove other things that kind of go into play with like Parker's background. In terms of why I chose novella length for this, I knew that I wanted the time constraint to be like a big thing. And so I knew I wanted like a quick, fast-paced thing where you can kind of feel the tension, like they have to reach this location at a certain time. And if they don't, they're screwed. So that the length itself of the story kind of informs that. Like you see you're running out of words as we're reading. Are you going to see these people rescued, or are they going to get eaten or something? So yeah, that was a big part of it.
One thing that I did notice is that while I would never call you a commercial fiction writer, and I'm not using this as a way to denigrate you in any way, shape, or form. one of the ways that commercial fiction writers increase tension to make you keep reading or keep viewing is that everything you do makes something worse. And so in the very first set of scenes, when they're basically trying to look out for their survival, they're just trying to get water. As soon as they try to go get water, bam, something goes wrong and the situation is worse because one of the people who has asthma has also had herself scraped up by the razor grass on the way to the water. And now she has anaphylactic shock or something else that might be worse going on with her. They don't know because this is an entirely alien biome to them. And so, yeah, everything gets worse as you go along, and it is the increasing ratcheting of the tension is masterfully done, which I should not be surprised by because you also scared the pants off of me with one of your stories from the horror episode. So thank you for that. It is now my touchstone for really good horror. So,
oh, thank you.
All right. So when working with Mocha Memoirs Press, did the editors accept this as submitted, or did they work through a revise and resubmit process with you on the story?
There was no real R&R. I think the story is basically what I wrote. I think the edits were more along the lines of just kind of having it fit their style. Making some scenes a bit more clear, maybe like minor type stuff. So yeah.
Okay, that's excellent.
Yeah.
I love an editor who respects what you've written as opposed to one who wants to
great.
Yeah, that is a wonderful thing to hear about them. The grief of the protagonist is a major plot and characterization point. If I may ask, and feel free to tell me to shut up, were you working through any grief of your own while you were working on this novella, or is this just whole cloth from imagination?
Not the same kind of grief. Like I was not working through anything during the writing of this novella, but as a mother, like she had a loss of a child, so I've had not the loss of a child, but one of my kids at birth almost died. And so I know what
Oh,
it's like to have, the kind of fear, a lot of what she talks about, like in her memories of, singing to her baby
yeah.
or whatever, that's directly from my own experience. So that's a little
Yeah.
autobiographical, but obviously my results were better. My baby's now a
That
teenager, so.
yeah. That really hit home because You Are My
Right.
Sunshine is something that I would sing to my son when he was a baby as well.
Yeah.
So I was just
And
like, oh
I
no,
did.
not that song.
Yeah. So that is real. And when I was writing this too, I knew that I wanted Parker to have some like mental and emotional struggles, because I've had to deal with that in my life.
Yeah.
So I it was so important to me to get that right and to not minimize it or make it like,
Yeah.
this thing is what caused all her problems. Like it's beyond more than just one thing. Like she was having relationship issues, she lost a baby, she's got, she was orphaned as a kid. Like it's kind of all built up, and just her own brain chemistry as well plays
Yeah.
a part. And I didn't want to end her story with like, yay, everything's fixed now, she's cured and she's super happy. I don't
No,
end the
it
story
wouldn't
that
fit
way.
her.
Right,
No.
exactly. So um I I tried it, to leave it like hopeful. Like, yes, this person is going to, keep fighting the good fight and, be okay. But it is something that she's going to always have to struggle with in some form or another.
Agreed.
So that was kind of
One of
like
the things
the driving force there.
One of the things that just stood out for me in terms of her characterization, just a shining sliver of a moment, was when she decided that she was the most expendable person and that she was going to be the one who was going to drink the water and see if it was safe. And that frustrated the hell out of her companions. But it was this moment of pure characterization, and it just illuminated her completely at that moment. So that was really nicely done.
Thanks.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about it, or before I move on to anybody else?
Yeah, about that specific scene. Yeah, she does kind of feel like she's not necessary, I guess, as far as existence goes, which is, super sad. But I feel like people who
Yeah.
are in that, and speaking from experience as well, as luckily I'm healthy right now, but
Yeah.
having been at that depth, I
Yeah.
wanted to convey basically the fact that she has no hope at the beginning of the story and she's given
Yeah.
up. And this situation forces her to fight for her life, which is the opposite of what she was doing. So
Exactly, yes. That's beautiful. Thank you.
thanks.
We're going to move now to Premee Mohamed with The Butcher of the Forest, which is coming out on the 27th of February, 2024 from Tor.com. So what is today? Today is the 28th, so it's out. It's available. I can link to it. Yes. Varys Thorne is someone who knows things, and she once rescued a child, broadly speaking, from the Elm Ever, the woods north of her village in which other people, and with air quotes around it, dwell. The tyrant that has conquered her village, excuse me, and countless others has lost his 2 children to those same woods and gives her a single day to save his children, or his men will kill and eat the people of her village, starting with her immediate family, a grandfather and an older aunt. She uses folklore and her own wits to navigate the woods within the woods, and makes an agreement with a fae-like creature for information that leads her to a house deep in the forest, which is where all the lost children wind up, at least at first. The story goes on from there, becoming progressively darker and darker. We go from conventional fantasy into dark fantasy, potentially into horror. I don't want to spoil things too much, but yeah. What gave you the inspiration for this novella, and why write it as a novella rather than a novel or a short story?
Yeah, I've talked about this a little bit in other places, but I'm hoping that one day this is going to end up on the Wikipedia article of literary works inspired by dreams, because that's actually what happened. Yeah.
Nice.
But it was one of those things where you wake up and of course you don't remember the rest of the dream. I only remembered a split second, so that was just what I wrote down on my phone. But I was in a throne room and someone behind me said something like, "But should the children be responsible for the sins of the father?" And I woke up and was like, well, that was creepy. Thank you, subconscious. But basically, it kept gnawing at me. I was like, what a horrible thing to say. Like, no, of course not. But also, like, coming from like Catholic school, like, yes, obviously. But I kind of ended up expanding from that. Like I reverse engineered the dream. I thought, okay, so it's a stone wall. Maybe we're in a castle or something. So this isn't like a modern mansion or palace or building of any kind. I see firelight, so maybe we don't have electricity. I see a throne, so we're under a monarchy of some kind. Maybe this is a fairy tale. Maybe this is like a fairy tale. And look at all those skulls on the wall. If this was a nice ruler, they would have taken down the skulls. So they must be like nasty and horrible. Maybe they're adding to them. So then I thought maybe this is the father, and maybe his children are in peril. Maybe he put them there. Maybe he just wants them out of danger. But because he's a powerful man, he's not going to do that himself, because powerful people never do anything themselves. They always force or pay someone else to do it. That's why they have staff. They don't want to get their own hands dirty.
Yeah.
So he goes
we
and
have
gets
people for
the
that.
single person. We have people for that. We have one people for that. So he goes and gets the single people for that and coerces her into going on this rescue mission. And the reason it's a novella was because I always intended for it to be a novella. It felt like it was novella length, but I think it's kind of like what I was talking about earlier, is when you have something a little bit experimental or gimmicky, sometimes that works at the novel length. And sometimes you think that's just going to wear out. It's welcome,
Yeah.
So a fairy tale should not be that long unless it's several other things. I just wanted to stick with the single through line of a rescue mission in which the main character believes that the story is over before it's actually over, because she doesn't know she's a fictional character. So that was kind of the entire goal there. It's really telling two stories: the story of now, the rescue now, and the story of the rescue before, which we don't really know till the end. So yeah, like I said, it's a premise. It's not going to hold up for the whole thing. Like when you think of those kind of single day novels, you run the gamut from like The Butcher of the Forest to like Ulysses, because of course that happens in a single day as well. But that also has a lot of like tangents and divagations, and you don't have room for that in a novella.
No, you really don't. No, I loved the folklore elements. I loved the being able to tell what food you had brought into the forest by putting writing on it, because the denizens of the forest can't write. They don't have that outside influence. So that was a lovely portion. I loved her giving the names back to the children by writing the names down. I'm like, yes, we have a meta element here. We're talking about the influence of writing and the power of words, and I love this. And I loved the whole concept of being a part of having the wild hunt after them. Only the wild hunt turned out to be a unicorn, and I thought they were supposed to be nice. No, they're not.
Unicorns are nice. I've had so many people message me and be like, bad unicorn, bad. Like, hi, thanks for reading. Send.
All right. When working with Tor.com Press, did the editors accept it as submitted, or did you have to work through some revision and resubmission?
Almost entirely as submitted. We had a couple of extremely minor, like, line level changes, and like the way the book kind of appeared in the world was sort of funny too. Like I think the morning after I had the dream, I tweeted something like I was going to work on this story that was like Escape from LA meets Edmund Spencer's The Fairy Queen, which it's kind of like
it is,
right? Like
it is.
So Varys is kind of like Snake Plissken. When you're very good at what you do, eventually people stop asking you to do it for money, and they just force you to do it. But an editor at Tor.com, actually, Jonathan Strahan, saw that, and he was like, if you're really writing this, I would be very interested in reading it. And I was like, well, I am really writing it, but I don't think you'll be very interested in reading it. But it didn't take me very long to write. It was something like 3 weekends, because at the time I still had my full-time job, so I could only work really on the weekends. Like 5 sessions or something, so like 15, 17 hours, something like that. And I polished it up. And I sat there for a bit like, oh, this is awkward. And then I sent it to my agent. Like, hey, I know you didn't expect this because I am supposed to be working on something else. And I included a screenshot of the tweet and was like, if he's serious, do you mind sending this to Jonathan first? Before we go out on broader sub. And like a week later or something, he was like, oh yeah, we're acquiring it. Thanks. So
I love this.
It was just a very serendipitous, right place, right time. Someone saw your social media post thing. And yeah, he kept a very, very light touch on it. It was basically like, should this be was or were? I'm like, I don't know about grammar. If you think it should be were, let's accept. I don't know. So yeah, very, 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 very minimal changes. Like almost literally nothing.
Beautiful. So what I'm hearing from all of you is that all four of you have had wonderful editors who have respected your vision and who have worked with you to make sure that your vision is what the readers see. So that is a wonderful thing. We have incredibly disparate stories, and I was remarking on this before the broadcast. We couldn't have picked 4 more disparate stories, so there's something for absolutely everyone in this broadcast, and they're all excellent. So go forth and read them. I will put links to the ones I have links to at the bottom of this. And now we're going to turn towards a little bit of a reading from Patty Cornell. This is going to be from Lost Cargo.
Yes.
Can you give us... are you just going to read from the beginning of the novella, or are you going to move to the middle, or what are you doing here?
It's from chapter 1, so it's not the very start, but it's when they wake up, that they're in stasis, traveling to the colony world they're going to go to, and they suddenly find themselves awake, and things are not what they had been told to expect. So the scene is from the point of view of my main character, Parker, and I guess I'll just get started. I woke to complete darkness, but didn't immediately register this fact due to the disorientation we'd been told was common when you emerge from suspension. They weren't kidding. When I finally shook away thoughts of Lily, I realized I was awake and felt a moment of panic. Unable to see, I focused on my remaining senses. My face was bare, so I knew the life support mask must have released its seal and fallen to the side. I could smell the sweet yet slightly cheesy scent of suspension gel. The air felt cold against my skin, which meant the cover of my suspension chamber must have unsealed and slid back to its space beneath the bed. The zero-grav restraints had retracted, so I could move, but when I did, my body felt heavy, my movements cumbersome. Still, gravity could only mean one thing. We'd landed. Without warning, bright light filled the pod interior, 1,000 daggers driven into my eyes. I raised an arm reflexively to shield them. When my eyes finally adjusted to the onslaught, I saw that an Asian man stood by the far wall next to an open panel, fiddling with the electronics it contained. Chai's son, I thought to myself. That was his name, but he'd asked us to call him Chai. He was an engineer from Thailand. Friendly guy. It was all starting to come back to me now. The motley crew of last-minute additions to the passenger roster. We'd been given a crash course in lieu of the extensive preparation earlier colonists had received and been told we'd learn the rest on Vida. They'd placed us wherever there were available suspension chambers. As a result, we'd ended up assigned to a pod with representatives from around the globe. Most of us could get by in English, but Chai, I recalled, used a translator, which I now noticed he wore clipped to his chest. I eased myself to a seated position, shivering as the air raised goosebumps on my arms. Rubbing them, I was surprised to find them still damp from the gel. The web-like one piece I wore also felt damp, as did the hair running down my back. That meant the flash drying stage between the gel suction and the opening of the chamber hadn't kicked on, which wasn't right, but I couldn't worry about that now. Some of the others also sat up. One man, David, sliding off his suspension bed to stand next to it. He remained there, taking a moment to find his balance. What happened? I asked no one in particular. Why were the lights off? Where's the AI? I was still a little foggy and could tell the others were too, but I remembered this wasn't how we were supposed to emerge from suspension. There should have been soft lighting, soothing music, and an AI, Lennox, to guide us back to the waking world. And we should have been dry. Chai spoke, the translator repeating his words in English for my benefit. I'm not sure. I'm attempting to bring Lennox online. It should be able to tell us what went wrong. But we're here, though, said David. We made it to Vida. He moved toward the door, leaning against his chamber as he went. What the? As he looked down, I saw what had caught his attention. The floor of the pod was at a slant, making it harder for him to walk, his balance not yet what it should be. He all but fell into the door as he reached it. I remembered they'd explained to us that the spherical pod was designed to right itself on landing, so no matter how it made ground, the floor would be stable. This was another thing that hadn't gone according to plan. I eased myself off my own bed and stood as David had, waiting for my balance to adjust to this new gravity. Slowly, I lowered myself to the storage compartment beneath the base that held my personal belongings. I rummaged through the items until my hand came to rest on the metal cylinder that held Lily's ashes, along with the small capsule I'd managed to smuggle aboard. Satisfied that they were where they should be, I shut the compartment and stood once more. David grabbed the door handle and pulled it toward the unlocked position, but it didn't open. He pulled the handle back to lock and tried again. Still nothing. With a groan, he threw his weight into the door, but it wasn't budging. Well, this is just great. A man with intricate tattoos on his exposed skin cleared his throat before speaking in a Kiwi accent. It's okay. Once Chai gets Lennox online, we'll get it to open the door, and if it's still stuck, we can contact the other pods. The other colonists will get us out. My flawless memory was returning in full force now. As he spoke, it brought up the image of a name tag. Hello, my name is Kauri Parada. I remembered him, an adventure guide and environmentalist. He was with the colonization project, a member of the Astrolife group the courts had assigned to partner with Terra Colonial following the backlash over their unethical practices under the former CEO. People like Kauri had joined the project to ensure the terraforming and subsequent colonization of Vita were done right, and to ensure people would still sign up for the project despite Terra Colonial's tarnished reputation. A shrill scream filled the pod, and I startled at the sound, far louder in this enclosed space than it would otherwise have been. It was the young Cuban woman, Natalie. She'd jumped down from her bed and lunged for the chamber next to hers. I saw then what had made her scream. 2 of the chambers remained sealed. The one Natalie was now frantically trying to force open held a middle-aged Italian woman, still covered in suspension gel. Mona, I recalled. The other held something no longer recognizable as a human being, but I knew it had once been her husband, Giorgio. Help me, Natalie yelled. We have to get her out. I looked to my left, my eyes meeting Kauri's. He held my gaze for a second, then calmly got off his bed and made his way over to Natalie. He grabbed her shoulders and turned her to face him, then said something I couldn't catch. But I didn't need to hear him to know it was already too late to help Mona or her husband. Across from me, Gerda, a Norwegian woman, let out a sob, then resumed quietly crying, tears streaming down her cheeks, her hand occasionally wiping them away. Her eyes were locked on the sealed chambers, and I could tell from her expression that she'd drawn the same conclusion I had. There had obviously been a problem with the gel suction and flash dry sequence in all our chambers, but in Mona's the gel hadn't suctioned out at all, nor had her chamber opened. But the mask had unsealed, and she'd suffocated in minutes. I only hoped she'd still been unconscious when it happened. Giorgio's chamber told a different and far more gruesome story. In his case, the gel had been suctioned out, but prior to landing. Landing was maybe too gentle a word, as the pods had been designed to essentially drop in free fall from space. Airbags and suspension gel ensured the occupants wouldn't feel a thing. It was likely the airbags had also failed to deploy the way they were meant to, and without the gel, there'd been nothing to absorb the impact for Giorgio when the pod hit the ground. At least his death would have been quick. It wasn't right, I thought, that they should die and I should live, me who had nothing and no one left to live for. I wanted to cry for them, but the tears didn't come. It seemed I'd spent the last of my tears on Lily.
That is so powerful of an opening. And again, I mentioned before the podcast that this put me in mind of Refractions by Mel Meltzer, who was on the podcast on our space opera episode. But her story obviously deviates rapidly from that same sense of disaster in space that you open with. You do a landing. She has hers be an explosion and flame inside the pods and things like that. And then hers becomes more political. Yours becomes more survival. But they both have that same powerful opening, and it really, really is effective. And you personalize it and humanize it so well.
Thank you.
So thank you for sharing it. All right, we are going to go ahead and move forward to what you guys all have coming out soon or out recently that you'd like other people to read. This is your chance to promote your works. So we're going to start at the top with Bendi. What is out recently or coming out soon that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is so much fun. Two things that...
Oh, it's a delight talking with you.
Yay! Two things to look out for are two collections coming out somewhat soon. One is sticking with the theme of Neon Hemlock Press and Dave Ring. Crawling Moon will be out, I think, sometime in 2024. I can't speak directly to the timeline because I don't want to give anything away, but it should be coming out in 2024. And then also towards the end of the year, there is Amplitudes, Stories of Queer and Trans Futurity, which is edited by Lee Mandello, which has a phenomenal table of content and should be out through Erewhon Books, I believe. And it is out in December of 2024. We're in 2024, right? Yeah.
We are in 2024.
Great. So those two are things that I'm immediately psyched about. I'm working on other stuff. You can always keep up with me at benmakesstuff.com. And if you're interested in the spicy stuff, I'm also on Patreon, patreon.com/BenjiBright. That's a pen name that my mom and I have had conversations about. She's going to be like, why do you keep bringing me up in these podcasts? And it's like, because I'm meant to embarrass you. That's what you have kids for.
If it's any help, my mom is basically my first reader to keep me as an accountable person on when I'm writing my novels, because I used to have a vast web of first readers and now it's down to basically her. So she has been reading my most recent stuff and she's like, it's okay, you can put spice in. I obviously have been around longer than this, and I'm like, I know, I used to read your romance novels when I was growing up, and I had a very warped perception of what romance was like because of those novels. But
that's perfect. Shout out to moms.
Yes, they're wonderful, but as you can tell by the pink in my cheeks, it's a little embarrassing to me. So.
Also embarrassing. I just don't flush as much, but I'm right there with you.
Yeah, I know. I'm right there with you. Laurence, coming out soon or out recently, what do you have?
All right. Well, my mother also reads all my work. I got over the embarrassment a while ago, but anyway. So this the novella we discussed. I'm not sure whether it's the end of this year or next year. Pâtissier, Étranger. Most recently, a novel came out from Water Dragon called The World Shattered Shell. It's a psychedelic found family philosophical adventure beyond the end of the world. Another one of these weird things that started from just this little writing exercise and just grew and grew. I'm also trying to sell an actual novella, though, called The Shadow Minister, because I admired the work of Max Fry, a Ukrainian author who writes in Russia and lives in Lithuania. And what she writes is this frothy light fantasy layered over dark fantasy. And so that's what I'm trying to do with The Shadow Minister.
Interesting. Patty, coming out soon or out recently that you'd like to have other people's eyeballs focused on?
I have a couple of pieces of short fiction coming out. I don't have any concrete dates for anything yet, but I know it's going to be like spring, summer for these. So one of them is a story called The Life You've Given Me, Rusty, which is coming out in Lightspeed. It's a flash piece. It's pretty much vibes. So if you like vibes, but they're dark vibes. I mean, you know me, Deborah. You know how I love the dark. So,
yes,
so that'll
wonderful.
that'll be coming out soon. And also a reprint of my sci-fi humor story, How to Impress a Top Food Critic and Put Your Restaurant on the Galactic Map, which we'll be
talking about that next week.
Talking about it next week too. So that's coming out in the new Dragon Gems spring issue. So that's kind of cool to have that out again. What else? What do I have out recently? I think my latest thing is Bright Horizons, which came out in Flame Tree Press's Learning to be Human anthology.
Oh, they make such pretty anthologies.
Oh, they do. So that one is like a story about an AI that runs a high school. So things don't go well. So that's not a spoiler. They don't go well from the start. So so that one's pretty cool. I'm proud of that one. Yeah, and so other than that, Lost Cargo's on its second year, so you can find out more about that on my website, pacornell.com, and all my fiction and stuff is on there. So that's really the best way to keep up with whatever I'm doing.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Premee, what about you? Do you have something coming out soon other than the novella that has just come out on the 27th?
Oh my God. Yeah. And thank you so much for inviting me to come chat novellas. Because, yeah, I have numerous novellas already out in the world. The Butcher of the Forest, which podcasters can't see me holding up the...
It's so pretty.
The fancy cover. Yeah, that came out February 27th. My next book is actually The Anti-Flash, which is the novel The Siege of Burning Grass, which is coming out from Solaris on March 12th in North America and the 14th in the UK, or I may have those reversed. Super excited for people to read that one. It's the story of a wounded pacifist who ends up going on a mission to hopefully end the war that's been plaguing his country and the neighboring country for generations. And then I guess the next thing out is the upcoming sequel to my 2021 novella, The Annual Migration of Clouds. And this one is called We Speak Through the Mountain. And that's out from ECW Press in June this year. So pretty excited for that one.
All right. Anything else? Anything else that anybody wants to talk about before we call this an episode and wrap it?
Just one quick shout out. I just wanted to say Premee Mohamed's and What Can We Offer You Tonight is so phenomenal, and you should go out and read it like yesterday. It's such a small, and I always feel bad about like burdening air quotes people with recommendations, but it's such like a delicious small bite, and we didn't talk about it today, but we should absolutely you should absolutely read it, and I'm just so glad that I get to like tell you how much I loved it to your face directly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it is very short, actually. And for a novella, it's almost like the Flash of novellas because it's just a little over 21,000 words. So it's like it's a small guy.
You could get through it on your lunch break and be a little bit heated from the contact high.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you guys so much for having been here to talk with me this week. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I say that every week, and every week is really true. Next week on Shining Moon, we'll be talking about food and foodways in fiction with D.A. Zhaolin Spires, Beth Cato, Nibedita Sen, Brent Lambert, and P.A. Cornell. So we'll be bringing back Patty. We'll be having more Patty content. Thank you all for listening. Hit the like and subscribe buttons if there are such buttons available for you to hit. And we are out.